It was a Tuesday night, the kind that smelled like burnt coffee and hopeless dreams, and I was halfway through my fourth double shift of the week. My feet aching, my hands smelling faintly of grease and bleach, my reflection in the diner window looking more like a ghost than a woman. Outside, the rain fell in sheets so heavy it made the neon sign flicker, the crimson glow of Marty's diner bleeding through the glass, like a wound that refused to close. I remember thinking that nothing ever changed in this part of town. The same cracked pavement, the same drunks hunched over the counter, the same broken jukebox humming low, and that maybe this was my punishment. To live out my days in the background of someone else's story. I was 24, broke and completely alone. My mother was gone, taken by cancer that devoured her faster than I could afford to save her. And my father had vanished a year after the funeral, leaving nothing behind but debts and a pile of broken promises. The debt collectors called, then stopped calling. When people stop calling, it's never because they've forgotten you. It's because they've found a better way to make you pay. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, and I was pouring coffee for a pair of truckers who smelled like diesel and despair when I heard the door slam open with such force that every head in the diner turned. The wind howled in behind him, dragging rain across the black and white floor tiles. He stumbled inside, tall, dressed in a dark suit, one hand clutching his side where blood soaked through the fabric. For a split second, I thought he was just another drunk with a bad night ahead of him. But then I saw the look in his eyes. Sharp, focused, predatory. And my stomach turned to ice. He scanned the room like a man who already knew the ending. And when his gaze landed on me, I swear the air changed. His voice was low, gravelly, the kind that carried power even when it was barely above a whisper. You. Kitchen. Now. Every rational thought screamed at me to run, to call the police, to do anything but obey. But there was something in his tone, something lethal and calm and oddly magnetic, that made my hands tremble as I led him through the swinging door into the back kitchen. He leaned against the stainless steel counter, his breathing shallow, his fingers slick with blood. I can call an ambulance, I said, but he shook his head, eyes narrowing. No cops, he rasped, and then with an eerie steadiness. They'll find me here. You don't want to be in the crossfire. I didn't want to be anywhere near this man, but something about the way his jaw tightened, the way his body refused to fall even though he was clearly dying, made me move anyway. I grabbed a clean towel and pressed it to his wound, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the rain outside. He hissed in pain, but didn't pull away. You shouldn't have done that, he said after a moment, his voice rough, almost regretful. Now they'll think you're with me. Who? I asked, but he didn't answer. Instead, he pushed himself upright, his blood-smeared hand gripping my wrist, and for a heartbeat I forgot how to breathe. His touch wasn't gentle, it wasn't meant to be, but his gaze was something else entirely. There was fire there, fury and exhaustion, and something dangerously close to sorrow. The lights flickered, and through the thin wall of the kitchen, I heard the screech of tires outside, the crunch of boots on wet pavement. He swore under his breath. Hide me, he said, and it wasn't a request. I should have told him no. I should have said I didn't owe him a damn thing. But instead, I found myself opening the door to the walk-in freezer, the chill rushing out like an exhale from hell. Get in, I whispered, my hands shaking. He hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. I followed, locking the heavy door behind us, the darkness pressing close. I could hear his breathing, rough and uneven, and my own pulse racing like I'd swallowed a storm. Outside, voices shouted, men, angry and organized, the kind that didn't belong to the police. She couldn't have gone far, one barked. She? Another said, laughing. You think he'd trust a woman to save him? My blood froze. They were looking for him, and now they were looking for me too. The man in the freezer, whoever he was, pressed a finger to his lips, his eyes gleaming even in the dim blue light. We stayed there, silent, while footsteps echoed through the diner, doors slamming, drawers being yanked open. One of them called out, "We'll find him, boss! He's bleeding like a pig!" When the footsteps faded and the rain swallowed their voices, I finally exhaled, my entire body trembling. The man leaned back against the metal wall, his breath visible in the cold. "You just signed your death sentence, sweetheart," he said quietly. I wanted to laugh or scream or maybe both. "You're welcome," I muttered, turning away. But when I looked at him again, I noticed how pale he was, how the towel I'd pressed against his wound was already soaked through. He wasn't just dangerous. He was dying. And for reasons I didn't understand, I couldn't just let him. I grabbed the first aid kit from the shelf, kneeling in front of him as I fumbled with the antiseptic and bandages. "Hold still," I said, though my voice shook. He smirked, the faintest flicker of amusement beneath the pain. "You've done this before?" "Only on myself," I said, which earned me a look, curious, maybe even respectful. When I finished, his hand came up to cover mine. His palm was warm, his grip firm. "What's your name?" "Ivy." "Ivy," he repeated slowly, as if committing it to memory. "I'm Luciano." The way he said it made my stomach twist. Not because of the name itself, but because it sounded like something dangerous, something final. Then distant sirens pierced the night. He pushed himself to his feet, blood still seeping through his shirt, and looked down at me with eyes that made me feel both seen and undone. "If anyone asks," he said, "you never saw me." He turned toward the door, steady despite the pain, and in the harsh light of the freezer, I saw the glint of a gun tucked beneath his jacket. Before he left, he paused and added almost softly, "You did a stupid thing tonight, Ivy, but brave. The world doesn't let brave people live long." And then he was gone, disappearing into the storm as if he'd never been there at all. I stood in that freezer long after the door shut, my fingers numb, my mind spinning. Outside, the rain had turned to a whisper against the windows, the neon light flickering again, red and relentless. I didn't know it then, but that night was the end of the life I thought I wanted. The quiet, invisible one. By morning, 2 men in black suits would be waiting outside my apartment, their faces unreadable, their message simple. "The boss wants to see you." And that was how my story with Luciano Moretti truly began. I didn't sleep that night, not really. Maybe I drifted in and out of something that looked like rest, but felt more like a trance. My body curled on the couch because I couldn't bear to crawl into the bed that still smelled like cheap detergent and loneliness. My mind replaying every second of the diner, until I wasn't sure if it had actually happened, or if it was just another one of my strange, desperate dreams, where danger looked like salvation, and salvation always came wearing a devil's grin. When dawn broke, the rain had stopped, but the world felt hollow, as if the storm had taken something with it. I moved through my apartment like a ghost, pouring stale coffee into a chipped mug, staring out the window at the cracked street below, where the puddles mirrored the gray of the sky. I told myself it was over, that the man with the blood and the eyes and the warning had vanished back into whatever hell he came from, and that I could go back to pretending my life was small and invisible and safe. But deep down, beneath the dull ache of exhaustion, there was a strange current humming under my skin, a pull I couldn't name, like the air before lightning. It was just past 8 when the knock came, firm, unhurried, and wrong. No one I knew knocked like that. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs, my fingers tightening around the coffee mug, until I realized that hiding would be useless. The knock came again, sharper this time. I opened the door halfway, ready to lie, ready to deny. but whatever I'd planned to say died the moment I saw them. Two men stood in the hallway, tall, suited, and perfectly still, the kind of stillness that only comes from discipline and danger. One of them had cold blue eyes and a scar that cut through his eyebrow. The other wore dark sunglasses, even though the hall light flickered like a dying bulb. "Miss Carter," the one with the scar said, his voice polite but empty, the kind of tone people use when politeness is a formality, not a kindness. "You'll need to come with us." I stared, my pulse thudding in my ears. "Who are you?" "Mr. Moretti sent us," he said, and the name hit me like a slap. Luciano. For a second I couldn't breathe. "I don't know what you're talking about," I managed to whisper, but the man in sunglasses tilted his head slightly, almost pitying. "Miss Carter, we can do this the easy way, or we can make it messy. He just wants to talk." Talk. Right. Because Mafia bosses always sent men in designer suits to politely talk. They didn't give me time to argue. Within minutes, I was in the back seat of a black car that smelled faintly of leather and power, the city sliding by outside the tinted windows like a fever dream. I didn't ask where we were going. I already knew it wasn't anywhere good. My hands were clasped in my lap, my mind spinning through every possible outcome, but no amount of panic could undo the choice I'd made when I opened that freezer door. After what felt like forever, the car turned off the main road, winding through iron gates that opened soundlessly, revealing a mansion that looked like something carved from darkness itself. Sprawling, immaculate, and terrifyingly beautiful. The kind of place that whispered wealth and screamed power. They led me inside without a word. The air smelled faintly of sandalwood and rain. The marble floors gleamed, the chandeliers dripped light like liquid gold, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear music. Soft piano notes that sounded too gentle for a place like this. When I finally saw him again, he was standing at the far end of a massive study, sunlight spilling through tall windows and catching on the edges of his dark suit. The blood and chaos from the night before were gone, replaced by something cold and controlled. He looked untouched by pain, untouched by weakness, untouched by anything human. Luciano Moretti. He didn't look at me right away. He poured himself a drink instead, swirling the amber liquid in his glass like he was weighing the value of silence. When he finally turned, his gaze met mine, and it was like being caught in the crosshairs of something that could both destroy and save you, depending on which mood it was in. "You have a talent for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, Ivy," he said, his voice calm, even smooth but carrying the edge of something sharp beneath it. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in my throat. I settled for, "You're welcome," and immediately regretted it when one corner of his mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "You think you saved me?" he asked, stepping closer. "You didn't save me. You just made yourself visible." His presence filled the room, thick and magnetic, the kind of danger that made the air feel too heavy to breathe. He was taller than I remembered, his movements precise, his suit fitting him like sin tailored to perfection. I could feel my pulse against my skin, and it wasn't just fear. It was something I didn't want to name. "I didn't ask for this," I said quietly, trying to hold his gaze even though every instinct told me to look away. "No one ever does," he replied, his voice softening for the briefest moment. Then, after a pause, "You helped me, and that means you're now on the radar of people who would rather see you dead than breathing the same air as me." "So what? You're here to kill me?" I said, my voice breaking despite my attempt to sound brave. He laughed, low, quiet, and humorless. "If I wanted you dead, Ivy, you'd never have seen my face again." Something about the way he said my name made it sound like both a promise and a threat. He walked past me then, close enough that his cologne, dark, expensive, intoxicating, brushed against my senses like smoke. "You'll stay here for a while," he said simply, "until I decide it's safe." "I can't just—" "You can," he interrupted, turning to face me again. "And you will. Think of it as protection." I let out a bitter laugh. "Protection from who? You?" He didn't flinch. "From everyone else." There was something in his eyes, something fractured and almost weary. And for a heartbeat, I thought I saw a man buried beneath the monster. But then he blinked, and it was gone. A woman appeared at the door, elegant in black, her expression unreadable. "Show Miss Carter to the guest room," he said, dismissing me with the ease of someone used to being obeyed. I followed the woman up the grand staircase, my legs shaky, my mind spinning, my heart refusing to slow down. The house was silent except for the faint echo of footsteps and that distant piano. Haunting, melancholic, like a memory someone refused to let die. The room they gave me was larger than my entire apartment, all white curtains and soft light and silence that felt too clean. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror across from me. I looked small, lost, out of place. But beneath that, I saw something else. A flicker of defiance, maybe even curiosity. Because the truth was, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't invisible. And somewhere down the hall, behind closed doors and shadows, the man who should have been my enemy was thinking of me too. I could feel it. The way the air pulsed with unspoken tension. That night, as I lay awake in the silk sheets that didn't belong to me, I heard footsteps pause outside my door. A quiet breath on the other side, and then the soft click of a lighter before retreating. Luciano Moretti didn't come in, but he didn't have to. I already knew that whatever he wanted from me had only just begun. The next morning came like a whispered threat. Pale light spilling through the gauzy curtains as if it were afraid to touch anything in this house. Afraid to disturb the kind of silence that didn't belong to peace but to power. I woke with the disorienting sense that I'd been dreaming of something beautiful and terrible at once. And when I opened my eyes, it took me a moment to remember where I was. Not in my tiny apartment with its peeling paint and flickering ceiling light, but in a mansion where every surface gleamed and every shadow seemed alive. I sat up slowly, the silk sheets whispering against my skin, and for a long moment I just listened. The faint hum of distant music, the rhythmic ticking of an antique clock somewhere down the hall, the occasional low murmur of voices too far away to make out. Everything felt foreign, opulent, suffocating. I told myself that I didn't belong here, that I should be afraid, that I should be planning how to escape. But instead there was a strange, quiet calm inside me. The kind that comes when you've already lost everything and have nothing left to fear. I found a robe hanging on the back of the door, soft and heavy, smelling faintly of jasmine, and wrapped it around myself before stepping into the hallway. The house was even more overwhelming in daylight. Wide corridors lined with oil paintings of people who probably died centuries ago. Marble floors so polished they reflected your every step, and chandeliers that caught the sun and scattered it like broken glass. It was beautiful, yes, but in the way that a predator is beautiful. Flawless, poised, and dangerous when you get too close. A woman I didn't know appeared at the end of the hall, her black dress perfectly pressed, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Moretti is waiting for you in the solarium," she said, and her voice had the smooth precision of someone used to obeying and being obeyed in turn. I followed her down a staircase that curved like the spine of something ancient, my bare feet making no sound on the cold marble. The solarium was a room of glass and green, sunlight pouring through high windows, plants curling around iron railings, the faint scent of citrus and earth. And there he was, sitting at a table with a newspaper and a cup of coffee. immaculate as always, like the blood and chaos of 2 nights ago had been erased from existence. Luciano looked up when I entered, and for a moment, the sunlight caught the edge of his face, softening the sharpness of his jaw, the intensity of his eyes. He smiled faintly, though it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind that made you wonder if he was amused by you, or already deciding how to use you. "Sleep well?" he asked, and the way he said it made the question feel like something else entirely. "Not really," I said, my voice too quiet, too honest. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit. Eat." There were pastries. On the table, fresh fruit, eggs still steaming. It had been so long since I'd seen food that didn't come from a diner grill that for a second, I forgot to be suspicious. But then I remembered who he was, and who I wasn't, and the food turned to glass in my throat. "I should go home," I said finally, staring at the coffee cup instead of at him. "I have a job, rent, a life." He folded the newspaper with the kind of slow grace that made the movement feel deliberate, almost dangerous. "You think you still have a life out there?" he said softly. "You helped me, Ivy. You involved yourself. That doesn't disappear because you pretend it didn't happen." I felt my pulse stutter. "I didn't involve myself," I said. "I saved someone who was bleeding out in front of me. That's not a crime." He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly. "In my world, everything is a crime, especially kindness." For a long moment, he just looked at me, and it was unbearable. The weight of his gaze, the silence stretching between us like a wire pulled too tight. Then he said, "I have a proposal for you." The words sent a chill down my spine. "A proposal?" I repeated, wary. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I own several businesses, clubs, restaurants. One of them is called the Velvet Room. You'll work there, quietly, discreetly. You'll stay close to me where I can keep an eye on you." I stared at him, disbelief clawing up my throat. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you protection," he corrected smoothly. "The job is just the cover." "And if I say no?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then you'll leave this house, and someone will follow you. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow. But eventually, they'll find you. They'll think you're mine. And that makes you leverage." The words were calm, matter of fact, like he was explaining the weather. I felt the air leave my lungs. "You're saying I don't have a choice?" "I'm saying that choices come with consequences," he said, "and some are more permanent than others." I wanted to scream, to tell him that he couldn't trap me in his world, that I was nobody, that none of this made sense. But deep down, beneath the anger and fear, there was something else simmering, something that made my voice falter. Because part of me knew he was right. The moment I'd helped him, I'd stepped into his orbit, and there was no stepping back. "Why me?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "You could have anyone working for you." He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze steady and unreadable. "Because you didn't run," he said. "Because you looked at me and didn't see what everyone else sees." I swallowed hard, unsure if that was an accusation or a compliment. He stood then, moving closer, his shadow falling over the table. And I realized how tall he was, how every movement carried the weight of command. "You'll start tonight," he said. 8 o'clock. A car will pick you up. Dress appropriately." He brushed past me on his way out, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air like smoke. I sat there long after he was gone, my hands trembling around the untouched cup of coffee, my mind trying to make sense of the madness that had become my life. Back in my room, I found a box waiting on the bed. Black ribbon, cream paper, no note. Inside was a dress, deep red silk that shimmered when it caught the light, along with matching heels that looked like they'd been made for someone who didn't have to think about rent or tips or survival. I didn't want to put it on. I didn't want to belong to this story. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city began to glow in gold and shadow, I realized that saying no wouldn't save me. That night, when the car came, I climbed in without a word. The streets blurred past, the engine humming low, and as we crossed the bridge into the city, I saw the sign ahead. The Velvet Room. Letters glowing in blood-red light. I thought of what he'd said, about protection and consequences, and I felt that strange pull again, the one that had started the night I found him bleeding in my diner. I didn't know it then, but I wasn't walking into a job. I was walking into the first chapter of my undoing. And somewhere inside that club, surrounded by smoke and sin and whispered power, Luciano Moretti was waiting. Not for an employee, but for a woman he'd already decided to claim. The car rolled through the city like a shadow on wheels, gliding past the sleeping buildings and flickering streetlights that turned the rain-slick asphalt into liquid silver. And as I sat in the back seat staring out the tinted window, I couldn't help but feel that I was watching the last pieces of my old life fade behind me. The cracked sidewalks, the broken diner neon, the endless repetition of nothingness, all of it slipping away into the dark. I didn't know where I was going exactly, though I supposed it didn't matter anymore, because wherever this road led, it was no longer mine to choose. When the car stopped, the driver, a silent man in a black suit whose eyes never met mine, opened my door and gestured toward a tall building that pulsed with red light and low music that I could feel through the pavement. The sign above the entrance read, "The Velvet Room," the letters sleek and sinuous, glowing like temptation itself. For a moment I hesitated, clutching my coat tighter around me, the night air thick with the mingled scents of rain and expensive perfume. But then the driver said softly, "Mr. Moretti is waiting." And the sound of his voice, low and certain, left me with no room to breathe, let alone argue. Inside, the world changed. The moment I stepped through those doors, it was like stepping into another universe, one made of smoke and silk, and secrets whispered against bare skin. The lighting was low and warm, the kind of golden glow that hid sins instead of exposing them, and the air was heavy with the scent of whiskey, roses, and the faint sweetness of burning cigars. Music drifted through the room, a slow jazz tune played by a live band in the corner, and the crowd was a blur of wealth and danger. Men in tailored suits, and women who looked like walking fire, all of them moving with a languid kind of grace that spoke of indulgence and power. I felt completely out of place, like an intruder in a dream I wasn't meant to see. My red silk dress, the one Luciano had left on my bed, clung to me like a secret, and though it fit perfectly, it made me feel exposed, marked somehow. Heads turned as I walked past the bar, whispers trailing in my wake, and I realized with a sharp pang that everyone here seemed to know who I was, or at least who they thought I was. The girl the boss had brought in. A woman with sleek dark hair and a voice that could cut glass approached me, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "You must be Ivy," she said, her red lips curving in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I'm Rosa. I manage the staff here. Mr. Moretti told me to take care of you." "Take care of me?" I echoed, unsure whether to be relieved or terrified. Her smile deepened, though her eyes stayed cold. "He said you're special." Something in her tone made me want to ask what special meant here, but I didn't. She led me through a maze of hallways, each one dimly lit, lined with velvet curtains and mirrors that reflected fragments of strangers, until we reached a room filled with racks of dresses, trays of jewelry, and a few other women getting ready, their laughter sharp and nervous. Rosa handed me a tray and gestured toward the door leading back to the main lounge. "You'll start simple," she said. "Private service. The boss doesn't want you behind the main bar." "The boss," I said quietly, rolling the words on my tongue, tasting the weight they carried. She gave me a look that was both warning and pity. You'll learn quickly, Ivy. Around here, he's not just the boss. He's the law. I didn't have time to respond because just then, a low voice behind me said, "That'll be all, Rosa." I turned, and there he was. Luciano Moretti, in a black suit that looked like it had been stitched by the devil himself. His tie loosened just enough to make him look human, though everything else about him screamed control. The air seemed to shift when he entered, people straightening, conversations lowering, the entire room adjusting to his gravity. He walked toward me slowly, his gaze sweeping over me with the kind of deliberate assessment that made my pulse trip over itself. "You clean up well," he said, his voice rough velvet, smooth but dangerous underneath. "I didn't realize I needed cleaning up," I said, though the words came out softer than I meant. That earned me the faintest curve of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but something that felt like one. "You belong here more than you think," he murmured, and I didn't know whether it was meant as comfort or a curse. He took the tray from my hand and set it aside, stepping closer. Close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that my breath caught. "This place," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear, "isn't just a club. It's a stage. Everyone plays a part. The trick is remembering which part is yours." "And what part is that supposed to be?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. His eyes flicked over my face, lingering for a moment too long. "That," he said, "is what I'm still deciding." Before I could answer, someone called for him from across the room. A man in a gray suit, tense, anxious. And just like that, Luciano's focus shifted. "Stay where I can see you," he said, the command slipping out like a habit, like something he didn't even have to think about. And then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd, leaving me standing there with my pulse racing and my skin still humming from the nearness of him. The rest of the night passed in a blur of sound and motion. Laughter that never reached anyone's eyes, deals whispered behind closed doors, glances exchanged like loaded weapons. I moved through it all like a ghost, serving drinks, offering polite smiles, pretending I belonged, while my mind buzzed with the knowledge that every person here owed their safety, their pleasure, their very existence to one man. The man who had pulled me into his orbit and left me spinning. At some point, I caught sight of him again in one of the private lounges, seated on a leather sofa with a glass of whiskey, listening to someone talk while his gaze drifted to me. Just for a moment. Just enough to make my breath hitch. His eyes didn't soften, didn't change, but I could feel the weight of them, the claim buried inside that simple look. When I finally stepped outside for air, the night had deepened, the city a blur of gold and shadow, and I leaned against the cold brick wall, trying to steady myself. The world inside the velvet room still clung to me. The scent of smoke and money, the hum of low laughter, the echo of his voice saying, "You belong here." But as I looked up at the sky, empty and endless, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just stepped into a gilded cage, one with silk bars and diamond locks, and that the most dangerous part of it wasn't the man who ruled it, but how easily I was already learning to stop wanting to leave. I didn't hear him until he was beside me. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Luciano said, his tone casual but carrying that undertone of authority that made disobedience feel impossible. I turned to face him, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The night stretched thin, between us, heavy with things neither of us wanted to admit. "I'm not used to this world," I said finally, the words escaping before I could stop them. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You will be," he said softly, almost kindly. "Everyone adjusts to power, Ivy. Eventually." And as he turned back toward the club, holding the door open for me, the faintest smile ghosted across his lips. Not cruel, not tender, just knowing. I followed him inside, the music swallowing us again, and I realized with a quiet, bone-deep certainty that whatever I had been before tonight, the waitress, the survivor, the girl with nothing left to lose, was gone. What he was shaping now was something new, something dangerous. And as the doors of the velvet room closed behind us, I couldn't tell whether he was saving me from the world or teaching me how to belong to his. Nights at the velvet room blurred together like spilled ink across silk, each one darker, louder, and heavier than the last. And before long, I stopped counting them altogether, because time in that place didn't move the way it did anywhere else. It stretched and folded and circled back on itself, trapping you inside the rhythm of the music, the hum of voices, the pulse of a world where pleasure was currency and loyalty was survival. I became part of the background, invisible but not unseen, gliding between tables with a practiced smile, serving drinks I couldn't afford to smell, watching men who would never be touched by consequence. And yet, through it all, I felt the constant presence of him, like gravity, unseen but always pulling. Luciano didn't come every night, but when he did, the room seemed to shift around him, the lights dimming just a little more, the air thickening as though it recognized its master. People spoke softer, moved slower, their eyes flicking toward him and then away again, and I understood with a kind of silent awe that his power wasn't loud or theatrical. It was quiet, certain, the kind that made even silence obey. I tried to stay out of his way when he was there, tried to blend into the smoke and shadows, but it was impossible to ignore him, not when every inch of him seemed designed to be noticed. He would sit in his corner booth, surrounded by men in suits who talked in half sentences and unfinished threats, his glass of whiskey always half full, his expression unreadable, his fingers absently turning the ring on his right hand. A thick gold band with a crest I never asked about, though I traced it with my eyes more often than I wanted to admit. One night, after the last guest had stumbled out and the music had faded to a whisper, I lingered by the bar, wiping down the polished surface just to have something to do. The others had gone home or disappeared upstairs, but I stayed because I couldn't bring myself to leave, not while he was still there, alone in the corner, cigarette smoke curling around him, like a secret. He didn't look up when he spoke, his voice low and rough from smoke and fatigue. "You should have been gone an hour ago, Ivy." "I couldn't sleep," I said, my voice quieter than the clink of glass against glass. He chuckled, soft and humorless. "Sleep doesn't come easy in this life. You get used to it." I hesitated before crossing the room, my heels echoing faintly on the marble floor. "Do you ever get used to it?" He looked up then, his eyes catching the dim light. Dark, unreadable, but carrying a tiredness I hadn't seen before. "No," he said after a long pause, exhaling smoke. "You just stop expecting rest to mean peace." I sat across from him without being invited, my hands folding in my lap, unsure whether I was brave or just foolish. "You talk like someone who's lost a lot." He didn't answer at first, just stared at the cigarette burning between his fingers, the ash growing long before he tapped it into the tray. "Loss is the only thing that teaches you anything worth knowing," he said eventually. "Everything else is noise." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, full of things neither of us wanted to say. I studied him, the shadows beneath his eyes, the faint scar along his jaw, the way his hand twitched once before he stilled it. He looked like a man carved out of control and regret, like someone who had once been soft but had all the softness beaten out of him until only steel remained. "Who did you lose?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't tell me, but then he said, very quietly, "Someone I loved. Someone who thought love could protect her from this life." He looked up then, and the weight of his gaze was enough to make my chest ache. She was wrong. I wanted to ask more, but something in his tone, the way the words seemed to come from somewhere far away, from a wound that hadn't healed, stopped me. So I just said softly, "I'm sorry." He smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "Don't be. You didn't kill her." The words hung between us like smoke, twisting, lingering, impossible to escape. I didn't know what to say, so I watched as he poured himself another drink, his movements slow, deliberate, as though control was the only thing keeping him standing. After a long while, he spoke again. "You shouldn't be here, Ivy. Not in this club, not in my world." "I didn't choose to be here," I said, my voice trembling just enough for him to notice. He met my eyes then, and the faintest hint of something, regret maybe, flickered across his expression. "No," he said quietly, "but you stayed." He wasn't wrong. I could have run. I could have disappeared before he found me again. But I hadn't. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was something far more dangerous. Curiosity, fascination, the way his darkness made mine feel less lonely. He leaned back, studying me like he was trying to solve a puzzle that refused to make sense. "You should know, Ivy," he said, his tone changing, becoming softer but heavier all at once. "I'm not the kind of man you can fix. Whatever you think you see in me, it's already broken beyond repair." "I wasn't trying to fix you," I said, though even I didn't believe it. That earned me a real smile, small and fleeting, but it was there. Good. Because people who try usually end up dead or worse. I didn't flinch at that, not because I wasn't afraid, but because fear had become such a constant companion that I didn't know how to separate it from anything else anymore. Instead, I looked at him and said, "Then why keep me here?" For a long moment, he didn't answer, just stared into the amber swirl of his glass. Then, without looking up, he said, "Because you remind me of her." The words struck like a match in the dark, small but burning. "Your fiancé," I said before I could stop myself. His eyes flicked up, sharp and dangerous, and I realized too late that I'd crossed a line. "You've been listening," he said, his tone soft but edged with something that made my stomach twist. "I just heard people talking," I stammered. "I didn't mean—" He cut me off with a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Don't apologize for curiosity, Ivy. It's the only honest sin left." He stood then, moving toward me, and I felt the air shift as he stopped beside my chair. "But some truths aren't safe to hold," he said, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "Some things are better left buried." I looked up at him. My breath caught in my throat, and for a heartbeat it felt like the whole world had gone still. The smoke curling between us, the silence pressing close, the tension so sharp it almost hurt. Then he reached out, brushed a strand of hair from my face with a touch so gentle it undid me completely and said, "Go home, Ivy, before you forget that you ever had one." I stood because I had to, because sitting there under the weight of him felt like drowning. And as I walked toward the door, my pulse echoing in my ears, I knew that I wouldn't sleep that night either. When I looked back once more, he was still standing there, half in shadow, smoke curling from the cigarette in his hand, his expression unreadable. But in his eyes, just for a second, I thought I saw it, the same hunger that had started in me. And as I stepped out into the cold night, the scent of whiskey and smoke clinging to my skin, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I was afraid of how much I wanted to be his undoing. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of low light, whispered conversations, and unspoken glances that lingered too long to be harmless. The velvet room had become something like a second skin, one I hadn't asked for but now couldn't take off, no matter how it suffocated me. I learned the rhythm of that place. when the power shifted, when the lies were sweetest, when the air changed just before something dangerous happened. I learned that eyes could touch, that silence could scream, that fear could look a lot like fascination. Luciano didn't speak to me much after that night in the empty club, but his absence was never really absence. I could feel him everywhere, in the way people spoke softer when they mentioned his name, in the way the world seemed to slow when he entered a room, and especially in the way my pulse betrayed me whenever he looked my way. It was on a Thursday, I think, when everything shifted again. Though time in his world didn't obey calendars or clocks, it obeyed him. I was refilling glasses at the back bar when Rosa appeared, her expression tight, her voice sharper than usual when she said, "The boss wants to see you." Those words still made my stomach twist. I followed her through a set of double doors and down a hallway I'd never been allowed to walk before. The air back there felt different, quieter, heavier, like the walls themselves were holding secrets they couldn't bear to repeat. At the end of the hall was a door made of dark wood, half open, and beyond it came the faint scent of smoke and expensive whiskey. Rosa nodded toward it once before leaving me there, her heels clicking away down the hall. I stepped inside. Luciano was there, of course, sitting at a long table made of black marble, surrounded by 3 men I didn't recognize. They looked like businessmen, at least on the surface. Well-dressed, polite smiles, eyes that didn't smile back. Papers were spread across the table, and a map lay open beside them. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't about money. It was about territory, power, control, the kind of conversation that decided who lived and who didn't. When he saw me, his expression didn't change, but something in his gaze sharpened. "Ivy," he said, gesturing to the seat beside him, his voice as smooth as ever. "Sit." I did, trying to keep my breathing steady. The man across from me, older, with slicked back hair and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, gave me a look that made my skin crawl. "She's new," he said, his accent thick, his tone mocking. "You always bring your waitresses to business meetings, Moretti?" Luciano didn't look at him when he answered. "She's not a waitress tonight." The man laughed, but it didn't last long, because Luciano's eyes finally lifted to meet his, and the silence that followed was enough to erase the smile from anyone's mouth. The meeting continued. Talk of shipments, alliances, something about the East District. And I tried to keep up, even though I understood only fragments. But I listened, because I'd learned quickly that listening in Luciano's world was more dangerous than speaking, and yet far more powerful. The more I listened, the more I realized that this wasn't just a discussion. It was a test. One of those invisible games men like him played, where words were weapons and glances were strategies. At one point, the man with the scar turned to Luciano and said something that changed the air in the room. "You've been growing soft," he said. "This city respects strength, not sentiment. And people talk, you know, about the girl." His eyes flicked to me with a smirk. "About the distraction." The sound of glass breaking filled the silence before I even realized Luciano had moved. His whiskey tumbler lay shattered on the floor, amber liquid bleeding into the cracks of the marble. "Careful," he said, his tone calm but lethal. "You're in my house." The man leaned back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Just an observation, Moretti. No offense meant." Luciano's gaze didn't waver. "Then take my advice and stop talking before I decide I don't care what you meant." The silence that followed was colder than the marble under my palms. For a moment, no one moved. Then Luciano turned his head slightly, his voice low but deliberate when he said, "Ivy, what do you think?" My heart stuttered. "About what?" He leaned back in his chair, his lips curving just slightly. "About trust." I looked at him, at the faint smile that wasn't really a smile, at the men watching me, waiting for me to stumble. And somehow, despite the fear, the words came. "I think trust isn't something you give," I said slowly. "It's something you trade. Everyone wants it, but no one gives it away for free." For a second, the room was still. Then one of the younger men chuckled, breaking the tension. "Smart girl." Luciano's gaze didn't leave mine. "No," he said softly. "She's observant." Something flickered in his eyes then. Pride, maybe, or curiosity, or something darker. And I realized, with a sudden rush of heat, that I'd just passed whatever test this was. The meeting ended not long after, though I barely remembered how. The men left one by one, the room emptying until it was just him and me, the faint scent of smoke hanging in the air between us. "You did well," he said finally, pouring another drink, his voice quieter now, less sharp. "You kept your composure." "I wasn't sure what you wanted me to do," I admitted. He handed me the glass, his fingers brushing mine just long enough to make my pulse trip. "You did exactly what I wanted," he said. "You listened." I took a sip. The whiskey was smooth and burning all at once, rich and heady, like everything else in his world. "You shouldn't have put me there," I said after a moment, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "That man, he could have—" He cut me off gently, his gaze steady. "He wouldn't have. Not while I was in the room." The way he said it made my chest tighten, because it wasn't arrogance. It was truth. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he set his glass down and said, "You see now, don't you? Power isn't about shouting the loudest or shooting the fastest. It's about knowing when silence will make them bleed." I didn't answer, but I understood. When I stood to leave, he caught my wrist. Not roughly, not possessively, but with a kind of careful precision, like he was trying to remember what gentleness felt like. "You did well," he repeated, softer this time. "But remember something, Ivy. The moment you stop being useful in this world, you stop being safe." I nodded, though the weight of his words settled like stone in my stomach. As I walked down the hall, the sound of his voice followed me, quiet, controlled, and impossibly sure. And yet beneath it all, there was something else, something that sounded a lot like warning. And maybe, if I let myself believe it, something like fear. That night, when I lay in my bed in his mansion, staring up at the ceiling painted in shadows, I realized something that made sleep impossible. It wasn't the violence or the danger that scared me anymore. It was the power. Because the more I stood near him, the more I understood that it was seeping into me, slow, invisible, intoxicating, and that I was starting to crave it just as much as I craved him. And I knew deep down that nothing good ever came from tasting something you were never meant to hold. The night it happened was colder than it should have been. The kind of cold that sinks into your skin and stays there, no matter how tightly you wrap yourself in heat and light and noise. The velvet room was alive that evening. Music spilling through the air in slow, seductive waves, laughter rising and falling like smoke, glasses clinking, silk dresses brushing past velvet walls, and for a moment I could almost pretend that everything around me was beautiful, that the danger I'd been balancing on for weeks was just a feeling, not a promise waiting to be kept. Luciano had been distant all night, his attention sharp, his mood coiled. I'd grown used to the weight of his gaze, the way he always seemed to be both everywhere and nowhere at once. But that evening, something was different. His focus was fractured, his voice lower when he spoke to his men, his hand tightening around his glass until I thought it might break. I felt the tension before I understood it, like the air was carrying a secret I wasn't meant to hear. I was serving drinks in the back lounge when I heard the first sound. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the metallic snap of something breaking that didn't belong to music or laughter. The second sound was sharper. A shout, a crash, a scream that sliced through the rhythm of the night like a knife through silk. I turned, my heart already racing, and that was when I saw the first man fall. The room erupted. Chairs overturned. Glasses shattered, bodies moved in chaos. I dropped the tray in my hands, the crash swallowed by the noise around me. The lights dimmed, flickered, went red for a heartbeat, and in that red glow I saw them. Men I didn't recognize. Faces half hidden beneath masks, guns in their hands, shouting in a language that wasn't English. Everything slowed. My pulse, the sounds, even the air itself seemed to freeze. And then, as if time snapped back into motion, the shooting began. I don't remember how I ended up behind the bar. Maybe instinct, maybe fear, crouched low, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, sharp and metallic, burning the back of my throat. Someone screamed again, and I pressed my hand against my mouth to keep from joining them. I heard footsteps, fast, heavy, coming closer, and then a voice, deep, familiar, commanding. "Get her out, Luciano." I lifted my head just enough to see him, standing in the center of the chaos, unflinching, his gun raised, his suit jacket gone, his shirt already streaked with blood that wasn't his. The sight of him should have terrified me, but instead it froze me in place, because even in that moment, even surrounded by violence and death, he looked untouchable, like something carved from war itself. One of his men grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the back exit. I stumbled after him, my legs trembling, my mind spinning too fast to make sense of anything. We were almost to the door when it happened. The sound that would stay with me forever. A gunshot. A sharp cry. And then the weight of the man beside me collapsing. He hit the ground hard, blood blooming across his chest like spilled wine. I froze, my body refusing to move. And then I saw the figure in the doorway. Tall, masked, gun raised. And before I could even think, before I could scream, the shot came. The force of it knocked me backward. I didn't realize I'd fallen until I felt the cold floor beneath me. My breath caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat. The world tilted, blurred, and then Luciano was there. On his knees beside me, his hand on my face, his voice cutting through the ringing in my ears. "Stay with me, Ivy." His eyes, God, his eyes, they weren't calm anymore. They were fire and fury and something I didn't recognize. I tried to speak, but the words came out broken. You're bleeding." He glanced down, almost absently, as if he hadn't noticed the crimson streaks across his shirt. "Not mine," he said, his tone steady, his fingers pressing against my neck to check for blood, for proof of life. "You're hit?" I shook my head. Or maybe I didn't. I couldn't tell. Everything was noise and color and fear. Another shout echoed from the hallway. Luciano stood, turning toward it, and in that instant I saw the transformation. The man I'd spoken with in the quiet hours. The one who smoked too much and looked at me, like I was something he couldn't decide whether to keep or destroy, was gone. What was left was something colder, darker, older. He moved like a shadow, gun raised, precise and unhesitating. The shots came fast, and the screams stopped just as quickly. When it was over, he came back for me, his breath rough, his hands slick with blood. "Get up," he said, his voice softer than it should have been. "We're leaving." I don't remember walking. I remember the smell of smoke, the taste of metal in my mouth, the sound of sirens in the distance, and the way his hand never let go of mine. We didn't stop until we were in the car, the door slamming shut behind us. The silence afterward was worse than the noise. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands shaking slightly. The first time I'd ever seen them do that. His jaw was clenched, his chest rising and falling like he'd forgotten how to breathe. I watched him in the dim light, unsure what to say, unsure if saying anything would break him further. Finally, he spoke. It was a message. I frowned. A message? He nodded once, his eyes still fixed on the floor. From someone who wanted to remind me what happens when I start thinking I can build something clean out of dirt. His words hit me in a place I didn't expect. You think this is your fault? He looked at me then. Really looked. And for the first time, I saw the truth beneath the armor. Everything is my fault, Ivy. That's the price of power. You don't get to pick which blood stains your hands. The car was moving now, the city lights flashing across his face, painting him in gold and shadow. I reached out, hesitating before touching his arm, my fingers brushing against his sleeve. He didn't pull away. You saved me, I said quietly. He shook his head. I put you there to begin with. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive. When we reached his house, he led me inside, silent, his movements mechanical, his expression unreadable. He poured himself a drink, the whiskey trembling slightly in the glass, and for a moment I thought he might break it just to feel something real. I wanted to tell him I wasn't afraid, that I wasn't leaving, that whatever had started between us, whatever it was, had already gone too deep to undo. But the words wouldn't come, not when I saw the look in his eyes, the one that said he'd already lost too much to let himself want again. So I just stood there, barefoot on the marble floor, the faint scent of smoke still clinging to my hair, and I watched as he turned toward the window, his reflection fractured by the glass, his voice barely audible when he said, "They touched what's mine." And in that moment, I realized something far more dangerous than fear. He wasn't just going to protect me, he was going to destroy for me. And God help me, some part of me wanted him to. The city was quieter after the attack, though it wasn't the kind of quiet that meant peace. It was the stillness that comes after a storm, the kind that hums with the threat of more violence waiting just beyond the horizon. The Velvet Room remained closed for repairs, though everyone knew it wasn't the walls that were broken. It was the illusion, the fragile idea that power could keep danger at bay, that Luciano Moretti could build a kingdom too solid to bleed. For days, the newspapers speculated, the whispers grew, and the men in suits started carrying their guns closer to their skin. The empire still stood, but it was trembling, and I could feel that tremor in everything. In the way Luciano spoke less and smoked more, in the way his gaze lingered on the windows as though expecting ghosts, and in the way his touch, when it came, was no longer gentle but desperate, like he was afraid I'd disappear if he didn't hold on tight enough. I tried to pretend that life continued as before, but pretending had always been my greatest act of survival, and even that skill began to crack beneath the weight of everything that had changed. The police had come, of course, though not in the way that television promised. There were no flashing lights, no arrests, only quiet visits from men in gray suits who spoke softly and left their cards like curses. I avoided them at first, avoiding everything that smelled of truth. But one morning, they came for me at the coffee shop near my apartment, if I could still call it mine, though I hadn't slept there in weeks. And before I knew it, I was sitting across from a detective whose eyes were the color of old steel and whose smile didn't reach his face. He introduced himself as Agent Wyatt, though he didn't bother to show a badge until I asked. And when he did, the movement was slow, deliberate, like he wanted me to understand that the badge wasn't a promise. It was a weapon. He spoke softly, like someone who had read too many confessions and learned that fear spoke louder when whispered to. "You've been working for Luciano Moretti," he said, not asking but stating, and I stayed silent because lies had no place to hide in rooms like that. "You were there the night of the shooting." Again, not a question. I watched the steam rise from my untouched coffee and said nothing, but he leaned closer. lowering his voice until I could feel his breath against my knuckles where my hands were folded tight. He's going down, Ivy. Sooner or later, they all do. And when he does, you'll either be the girl who helped him fall or the one who falls with him. I wanted to laugh, though nothing about it was funny. I wanted to tell him that he didn't understand, that Luciano wasn't a man you could trap with laws or cages, that his world didn't play by the same rules as theirs. But the truth caught behind my teeth and stayed there, heavy and poisonous. I don't know anything, I said finally, and even as the words left my mouth, I knew how weak they sounded. Wyatt smiled faintly, tapping his pen against the table. That's not true. You know everything. You see things no one else does. You're close to him. His tone made close sound like a sin. When I didn't respond, he reached into his briefcase and slid something across the table. A small black recorder, sleek and ordinary, the kind that could disappear into a pocket or a purse without being noticed. You wear this, he said quietly. You talk to him. You give us what we need. You walk away clean. I stared at it, my heart beating too loud in my ears. And if I don't? He smiled again, softer this time, though his eyes stayed cold. Then you'll go down with him. And trust me, Ivy, the system doesn't care who loved who. It only cares about who talks first. When I left the cafe, the world looked different. Too bright. Too real. As if every sound and color was trying to force me to see what I'd been pretending not to. I walked until my legs ached, until the city blurred around me, until I ended up standing at the edge of the East River. The wind sharp and relentless. The water dark and endless. I thought of running. Really running this time. Of disappearing into another name, another city, another life. But then I thought of him. Of the way he'd said they touched what's mine. And I knew that running wasn't freedom anymore. It was betrayal. That night I went back to his house. The guards at the gate let me through without a word. They knew who I was now, though I wasn't sure if that made me safer or more vulnerable. Inside, the house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like someone has just finished screaming. I found him in his study, the room heavy with cigar smoke and silence, his jacket discarded over the back of a chair, his tie undone, his sleeves rolled up, revealing the scars along his forearms, reminders that power was never earned without blood. He didn't look up when I entered. You met with them, he said, his voice low, calm, but threaded with steel. I froze. What? He turned then, his eyes dark and steady, and I realized there was no point in pretending. Luciano Moretti always knew. The police, he said. The feds. Whatever they call themselves. You met them. I didn't tell them anything, I said quickly, the words tripping over themselves. They approached me. I didn't... He stood, slow and deliberate, and the movement made my breath catch. Did you wear it? He asked. For a moment I didn't understand, and then I saw his gaze flick toward my coat pocket, where the recorder still hid, untouched, but heavy as guilt. I felt my face pale. I didn't use it, I whispered. I couldn't. He stepped closer, his voice quiet, but no less dangerous. But you kept it. I wanted to explain, to tell him that I hadn't meant to, that I hadn't known what to do, that I was scared, but the words died before they reached my lips because I knew it didn't matter. In his world, hesitation was betrayal, and betrayal was death. His hand came up, brushing my cheek, his touch deceptively gentle. You should have thrown it in the river, Ivy. I couldn't, I said again, and this time it came out like a confession, small and broken. Because if I did, I'd have nothing left to prove I wasn't one of them. For a heartbeat, he just stared at me, and then something shifted. The anger in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something that hurt even more. Disappointment. He turned away, walking toward the window. the light from the street cutting across his face in sharp angles. "You were the only thing in this world I didn't have to question," he said quietly. "And now I do." The silence that followed was unbearable. I wanted him to yell, to threaten, to break something, anything but this quiet that sounded like goodbye. "I didn't betray you," I whispered. "I chose you." He turned then, and in the space between us, I saw the war inside him, the part that wanted to believe me and the part that couldn't afford to. "Then prove it," he said finally. "How?" His gaze held mine, unblinking. "Stay. Don't run. Don't lie. Let me see who you really are when the walls come down." I nodded, though my heart was breaking. "And if I can't?" He stepped closer again, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin, close enough that the scent of smoke and whiskey and danger wrapped around me like a second heartbeat. "Then I'll find out for myself," he said softly, almost tenderly. And somehow that promise terrified me more than any threat ever could. That night I lay awake in his bed, the recorder still sitting in the drawer by my side, untouched, but whispering to me all the same. Outside, the city moved on, sirens in the distance, rain on the glass. But inside, the only sound was his breathing beside me, steady and fragile, like the rhythm of something about to break. And as I stared into the darkness, I realized the cost of loyalty wasn't just blood or truth. It was becoming the very thing you swore you never would. The days that followed bled together like a bruise, slow and deep and aching beneath the surface. And though the city still moved and the world still breathed, everything inside me felt suspended, caught between the ruin I'd chosen and the redemption I knew I'd never earn. Luciano's house became a labyrinth of silence, a palace of ghosts, marble cold beneath my bare feet, the air thick with unspoken things neither of us could bring ourselves to say. He still spoke to me sometimes, but the warmth was gone, replaced by something brittle, something dangerous, as if every word between us had to be weighed before it was allowed to live. He hadn't asked again about the recorder, and I hadn't dared mention it, though it still sat in the drawer beside my bed, humming with its invisible threat. A reminder that my loyalty, no matter how pure I wanted it to be, was tainted by the fear that had once made me take it. I told myself I'd destroy it. Every night I promised myself I'd throw it away, crush it, bury it, anything to erase what it represented. But I never did, because some broken part of me needed to keep it, like proof of the life I'd had before him, before the world turned red and I stopped recognizing my own reflection. Luciano changed too. The man who had once held danger like a weapon now carried it like a disease. His temper, always sharp, became unpredictable, the cracks in his control growing wider with each passing day. His men came and went in whispers, their faces tight, their eyes avoiding mine. The attack at the Velvet Room had set something into motion, something bigger than either of us, and though he never said it out loud, I knew. The war had begun. It happened one night when the rain wouldn't stop falling, when the city outside his windows looked like it was drowning. He hadn't come home yet, and I was pacing the length of the study, the fire burning low, the clock ticking loud enough to make my teeth ache. I tried reading one of his books, but the words blurred, turning to static in my head. The phone on his desk rang once, twice, then fell silent. When it rang again, I answered before I could think. "Ivy?" The voice on the other end was low, urgent, unfamiliar. "You need to leave the house, now." My throat went dry. "Who is this?" There was a pause, then, "Someone who doesn't want you to die tonight." The line went dead. For a moment I couldn't move. Then instinct, that same terrible instinct that had saved me once before, kicked in. I grabbed my coat, slipped the recorder into my pocket without even meaning to, and started toward the back door. But when I reached the hallway, I froze. Luciano was standing there. He looked like sin wrapped in blood, his white shirt soaked through, his knuckles raw, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice low, almost lazy, but the danger in it was unmistakable. I heard." He stepped closer, his boots leaving faint prints of red on the marble, his expression unreadable. "You heard what?" "That someone was coming," I said, my words trembling out of me. "They said—" "They?" he interrupted, his tone slicing through the air like a blade. "Who's they, Ivy?" I opened my mouth, but no sound came. His gaze dropped to my pocket, and I felt my stomach twist into ice. He reached out, slow, deliberate, and when his fingers closed around the small, hard shape of the recorder, I felt everything inside me collapse. He held it up between us, the firelight glinting off its silver edge. "You kept it." I wanted to explain, to tell him it wasn't what it looked like, that I'd never used it, that I'd only kept it because I didn't know what else to do. But the words tangled in my throat, useless and broken. "Luciano, please," I whispered. "I didn't—" He threw it against the wall. The sound of it shattering was louder than the thunder outside. The silence that followed was unbearable. When he spoke again, his voice was calm. Too calm. "You could have ruined everything." "I wasn't going to," I said, but the words came out strangled, desperate. "I would never—" "Wouldn't you?" He took a step closer, his eyes locked on mine, and I saw something there that terrified me. Not rage, not betrayal, but heartbreak. "You were my one clean thing, Ivy, the only part of me that wasn't built on blood and lies, and now—" He stopped, exhaling sharply, as if the rest was too painful to say. I reached for him then, my hands trembling, but he caught my wrist, his grip firm but not cruel. "Do you know what happens to people who betray me?" he asked quietly, and though the words were meant as a threat, they sounded like grief. "I didn't betray you," I said, the words breaking on a sob. "I love you." He froze, his hand still wrapped around mine, his pulse hammering beneath his skin. For a long, unbearable moment, neither of us moved. Then slowly his grip loosened. "Love," he said softly, almost to himself. "That's the worst kind of betrayal there is." Before I could answer, the sound of engines cut through the rain outside. Fast, too many of them, stopping hard at the gates. Luciano turned toward the window, his body going rigid. "They're here," he said, his voice suddenly sharp again. "Who?" He didn't answer. He just looked back at me, his expression torn between fury and something like sorrow. "You need to go, Ivy." "I'm not leaving you," I said, the words instinctive, foolish, true. He smiled then, but it was a broken thing. "You already did." The first explosion shattered the windows, glass raining down in glittering shards. Luciano pushed me down before I even knew what was happening, the sound of gunfire following, loud and relentless. He reached for the gun at his hip, the motion fluid, automatic, as bullets tore through the walls. I crawled toward him, shouting his name, but the noise swallowed everything. He turned once, his eyes finding mine, and in that instant, that breath suspended between chaos and silence, I saw it again. That same fire I'd seen the night we met. The man who never begged, never bent, looked at me like I was the only thing left worth fighting for. "Run!" he said. But I didn't. Because I couldn't. The door burst open and the world exploded in sound and smoke. I saw Luciano fire, saw the flash of muzzle light, saw men falling, saw blood bloom against white marble, and then something slammed into me. The force of it knocking me backward, stealing the air from my lungs. I hit the floor hard, my vision spinning, the ceiling above me, fractured by smoke and flame. I could hear his voice, still, distant, shouting my name, but it was fading, slipping away like a dream. For a moment, I thought of the diner, of the girl I used to be, the one who thought saving a stranger was an act of kindness, not the beginning of her undoing. And as the darkness closed in, I thought I heard him, Luciano, whisper something, soft and broken. Ivy, stay with me. Then everything went quiet. The world had grown quieter, but it wasn't peace that filled the silence. It was the kind of stillness that comes after something has broken, the way the air feels heavy after glass shatters when you can still smell the sharpness of it, even if you can't see the pieces anymore. Days slipped by in fragments that didn't make sense, mornings that felt like endings, nights that never seemed to sleep. And I existed somewhere in between, half buried in guilt, half drowning in a love I no longer knew how to hold without cutting myself on its edges. Luciano was there, but not in the way he used to be. Not the man who once made danger look like a promise. Not the man who could turn a whisper into a confession with one look. He was quieter now, colder, like something inside him had died the night of the attack, and he'd buried it somewhere I couldn't reach. He still touched me sometimes, his hand ghosting along my skin like he was trying to remember what warmth felt like. But his eyes were distant, locked on something invisible, something that didn't belong to this world or to me. The walls of his house, once beautiful, had started to close in. His men came and went like shadows, their voices hushed, their faces strained, the scent of gun oil and fear clinging to their clothes. Every conversation I overheard was half a threat, half a prayer. The war that had been whispered about in corners had arrived in full, and though Luciano never said it, I could feel it in the air. He was losing control, not of his empire, but of himself. And I, God help me, was losing him. It started small, as all tragedies do. A missed night, a phone call that ended too fast, a whispered order that silenced when I entered the room. I told myself not to ask questions, that in his world, curiosity was a blade too sharp to hold. But the doubt grew anyway, feeding on the silence between us. I told myself I trusted him, that he would never hurt me, that what we had was real. But every time I looked at him, I saw the man who had once told me trust was a transaction, and love was the most dangerous debt of all. One evening, when the sky outside bled into the color of old wine, and the city lights flickered like dying stars, I found him in his office, standing over the desk, his hands braced on the edge, his head bowed. The lamp beside him cast a soft amber glow, illuminating the smoke curling from the cigarette between his fingers. I hesitated in the doorway, my heart tight in my chest. "You're shaking," he said without turning around. "I'm not," I whispered, though I was. He exhaled slowly, the smoke drifting toward the ceiling. "You think I don't feel it? The distance? The fear?" He finally turned, his eyes dark and burning. "You think I don't see what it's doing to you?" I wanted to lie, to say I was fine, that the cracks in me weren't growing wider every time he looked at me with suspicion instead of tenderness. But the truth slipped out before I could stop it. "I don't know who you are anymore." The silence that followed was unbearable. He put out the cigarette, his movements deliberate, controlled, the way they always were when he was trying not to explode. "You knew who I was from the start," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "You just pretended I was something else because it made it easier to love me." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "And what are you, Luciano?" He stepped closer, his presence filling the room, his eyes glinting in the half-light. "I'm the man who kills to protect what's his," he said, and though the words were meant to frighten me, they didn't. They broke me. I turned away because I couldn't bear to look at him, at the truth of what we'd become. "And what am I then?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally did, his voice was softer than I expected. "You're the only thing I wish I didn't have to protect." That was the moment I realized he didn't just expect to lose me. He was already preparing for it. That night I couldn't sleep. I wandered through the house barefoot, the air thick and heavy, the scent of rain lingering outside. In the reflection of the window, I saw myself, pale, hollow-eyed, a stranger wearing my face, and I wondered how it had come to this, how I had become a woman who loved a man built of blood and shadow, who had traded safety for the illusion of belonging. I was still standing there when I heard the knock. 3 slow raps, steady, deliberate. My stomach dropped. I turned toward the door, but before I could move, it opened. 2 men stepped inside, dressed in black. The kind of black that wasn't meant for elegance, but for erasing things. One of them nodded at me, the other closed the door behind them. "Miss Carter," the taller one said, his voice smooth but hard. "We're here for Mr. Moretti." I stared, my pulse racing. "He's not here," I said too quickly. They exchanged a look. "Then you'll do." The words hadn't even registered before one of them reached for me. I reacted before thinking, shoving him back, the adrenaline burning through me like fire. He stumbled, cursed, then grabbed my wrist. The other one moved fast, catching my shoulder, twisting my arm behind my back. Pain flared white-hot, and I gasped, struggling, kicking, shouting his name. "Luciano!" The sound of his name ripped through the house, raw and terrified. The door to the hallway burst open. He appeared like a storm. No hesitation, no words, just movement. The gun was already in his hand when he entered, his eyes wild, sharp, unrecognizable. The first shot was deafening. The man holding me fell before I even saw the bullet hit. The second turned the air to thunder. And then there was silence, except for my heartbeat, loud and frantic. Luciano stood there, chest rising and falling, smoke curling from the gun in his hand. He looked at me, not at the bodies, not at the blood seeping across the floor, just at me. His voice was low, shaking, but not from fear. "They knew where to find you." "Luciano." He stepped forward, his hand trembling as he touched my face, his thumb smearing blood I hadn't realized was mine. "You need to go. Now." "I'm not leaving you," I said, though my voice broke on the last word. He smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that hurts to see, the kind that belongs to a man who already knows how the story ends. "You don't understand," he said softly. "It's already too late." Before I could ask what he meant, the window behind him shattered. The explosion of glass was followed by the sound of more footsteps, shouting, gunfire, chaos spilling into the house like water through a broken dam. Luciano shoved me toward the back hallway, his voice sharp, commanding, the voice of the man who ruled empires. "Run, Ivy!" I hesitated for a heartbeat too long. Long enough to see him turn, long enough to see him raise his gun again, long enough to hear the echo of another shot. And then I saw him fall. The world fractured in that instant, collapsing into noise and color and pain. I screamed his name, but the smoke swallowed the sound, the flames painting the marble gold and red. I tried to reach him, to crawl through the chaos, but strong hands grabbed me from behind, dragging me away from the fire, from the blood, from him. "No!" I fought, clawed, screamed, but they didn't let go. I caught one last glimpse. Luciano, lying on the floor, his blood blooming across the white marble like spilled ink, his hand twitching once before it went still. Then the door slammed behind me, and the house exploded into light. The silence after an explosion is not silence at all. It's a living, breathing thing. A monster made of echoes and ghosts, the kind that crawls into your ears and stays there, whispering reminders of everything that burned. I remember the heat first, the kind that felt alive, the kind that stole the air before I could scream again. I remember the smoke stinging my eyes, turning the world into a canvas of flame and shadow. And I remember his name tearing out of my throat like a prayer I didn't know how to finish. Luciano. When I woke, I was in a hospital. White walls, white sheets, white light, the color of nothing. The sound of monitors hummed beside me, steady and artificial, reminding me that I was still, here, that somehow I had survived what I wasn't supposed to. My body ached, but it was the quiet that hurt most. The quiet that came when you realized there was no one left to call your name. A nurse told me it had been 3 days. 3 days since the fire. 3 days since the police had stormed the house. 3 days since everything that had defined me had gone up in smoke. I asked about him before she could even finish her sentence, and the look that crossed her face told me more than any words ever could. They said the fire was too intense, that the house had collapsed before they could reach him, that no remains were recovered that could be identified. I wanted to believe he was gone. Truly gone, because believing otherwise was unbearable, but some small broken piece of me refused. He was too strong, too deliberate, too much of a force to simply vanish into dust. Luciano Moretti didn't die. He disappeared. The police came for me the next day. Agent Wyatt among them, his face as cold and smug as I remembered. He spoke softly, the way men do when they think they've already won. "You're lucky," he said. "You got out before it all went to hell." I almost laughed, though the sound would have been hollow. Lucky. That word didn't belong to me. Lucky was the girl I'd been before, the one who worked double shifts and fell asleep smelling of coffee and dish soap, the one who thought survival meant staying invisible. That girl was gone. The woman who sat there now, her hands trembling on the hospital blanket, had blood in her memory and fire in her lungs. Wyatt asked questions, of course, where I'd been, what I'd seen, who I'd spoken to, and I answered in fragments, giving him nothing that mattered. He kept circling back to the same word: proof. Proof of his crimes, proof of his death, proof that I hadn't been part of it. He didn't understand that what Luciano left behind couldn't be measured in evidence. It lived in whispers, in fear, in the way the city itself seemed to hold its breath when his name was spoken. When they left, I signed the discharge papers without really reading them. I didn't know where to go. My apartment was long gone, the velvet room reduced to ash. I walked for hours that night, through streets that still felt like his, through rain that clung to my skin until I couldn't tell where the tears began. Every corner of the city reminded me of him. The shadowed alleys where he'd first found me. The river that reflected the same darkness I'd seen in his eyes. The diner that still stood, flickering neon, promising warmth to strangers who didn't yet know how fragile safety really was. I went inside, though it felt like walking backward through time. The same cracked vinyl booths, the same hum of the old jukebox, the same smell of burnt coffee. I sat in the corner booth, the one I used to clean every night before closing, and for a moment, I could almost pretend none of it had happened, that I was still just a waitress with nothing to lose. But the moment I closed my eyes, I saw him again. The way his hands shook when he thought no one was watching. The way his voice softened when he said my name. The way his world had burned so mine could keep spinning. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Maybe a sign, maybe a ghost. And then I saw it. A man in a dark coat stood across the street, half hidden by the rain. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even try to come closer. But the way he stood, the tilt of his head, the stillness in his shoulders, it was him. It had to be. My heart stuttered, my breath caught, and for a second I thought I might run to him. But then he turned away, slow and deliberate, disappearing into the fog like a dream you wake from too soon. I pressed my palm to the glass, whispering his name, but he was already gone. After that night, I started moving again, Not because I had a destination, but because I couldn't stand still. I left the city, trading skyscrapers for highways, neon for moonlight, noise for silence. I found work where no one asked questions. A bar in a nowhere town, the kind of place where everyone was running from something. The pay was bad, the nights were long, and the customers talked too much. But the routine felt almost holy. I poured drinks, I smiled, I listened to the static hum of country songs on a radio older than me. It was simple, it was empty, it was survival. But sometimes, when the night was too quiet and the rain tapped softly against the windows, I'd look up and imagine him there, leaning against the bar, eyes shadowed, tie loosened, that faint, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He'd say something like, "You can't hide from ghosts, Ivy." And I'd almost answer before remembering he wasn't real anymore. Months passed like that, the seasons changing without my permission, the ache fading only because it had nowhere left to grow. I thought I was healing, or at least learning to live with the pieces. And then, one night, I found an envelope waiting on my doorstep. No address, no name, just a wax seal pressed with a crest I'd only ever seen on one man's ring. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper. For the girl who taught me how to bleed. No signature, no explanation, but beneath the words was something else. A photo. It was grainy, taken from a distance, but I knew that face, that stance, that impossible calm. Luciano. Alive. Older, maybe, but unmistakable. Standing beside a car I didn't recognize, in front of a horizon that could have been anywhere. A coastline, maybe. Somewhere far from all this. I stared at it until the edges blurred. My heart was racing, my hands trembling, my mind caught between relief and despair. Because if he was alive, it meant he'd chosen not to come back for me. And yet, he'd found a way to let me know I was never forgotten. That night, I sat by the window until dawn, the photo clutched in my hand, the first light of morning spilling across the floor. The sky was pale and endless, the kind of sky that doesn't promise anything, and maybe that was the point. Some loves aren't meant to last. They're meant to change you, to destroy the person you were so you can become the one you were always meant to be. He had once told me that power wasn't about who lived or died, but about who remembered. And as the sun rose over a world that no longer felt like it was trying to kill me, I realized that remembering him wasn't a weakness anymore. It was the only kind of power I had left. I'm not a waitress anymore. I'm not a pawn in someone else's war. I'm the ghost that walked out of the fire, the girl who learned that love doesn't always save you. Sometimes it just teaches you how to survive the ruins. And maybe, somewhere out there, in a city I'll never see again, he's looking at the same sky, thinking the same thought, that we were never meant to be forever. We were meant to be unforgettable.